I've been, in the last year, I've done almost a dozen now debates with many of these leading atheists. And in one of these debates, my opponent said to me, Dinesh, you call yourself a Christian, but you're an atheist. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, you don't believe in most of the gods that have been advanced in the great sweep of human history, do you? He said, for example, do you believe in Krishna? I said, no. He said, do you believe in Allah? No. He said, do you believe in Zoroaster? No. Do you believe in Thor or Baal or Zeus or Poseidon or Hera? No. He said, well, then when it comes to 99% of all the gods that have been advanced through the great sweep of time, you are in fact an atheist. He said, the only difference between you and me is that I take your God and I add him to this long, interminable list. So this is a feeling for what the new atheism sounds like. And it comes at a time when, as I say, as Christians, we sometimes aren't quite sure how to cope with it. I think one reason for this, by the way, is that since the 1960s, there's been a tremendous emphasis in America on experiential Christianity. Let me tell you what Jesus has done in my life. And the experiential approach, which is often accompanied by an appeal to Scripture. As Christians, if we have a problem, we say, okay, let me turn to Scripture. So if you say, Mr. Christian, why do you think this? The answer is the book of Leviticus says this, or the Gospel of Luke says that. And this approach is fine if you are talking to a fellow Christian. But if you're speaking to a secular guy or to an atheist, they're going to say, well, who cares what the Gospel of Luke says? We reject the authority of the Bible to adjudicate the matter. And then, as Christians, we're sometimes a little bit tongue-tied because that was our argument. I want to identify a second problem, one which was very much my own problem. Stan mentioned earlier I was raised in India, raised as a Christian. But now when I think back, I didn't learn Christianity so much as I learned what could be called crayon Christianity. I learned my Christianity at my parents' knee when I was 4 years old or 5 or 6. Well, this was not a mature adult Christianity. It was a Christianity adapted to my very young mind. And that's the Christianity that at the age of 17 I brought to America as an exchange student. It's the Christianity I took a year later to the Dartmouth campus. And that kind of Christianity soon came under withering skeptical assault. Dinesh, what are you saying? You believe someone was born of a virgin and walked on the ocean, brought dead people back to life? Are you out of your mind? We're living in the 21st century. Don't you believe that the world operates according to fixed, incorrigible laws? You think these laws can be suspended at somebody's whim or discretion? So, faced with this kind of a critique at that young age of 17 or 18, I found myself becoming defensive, but becoming defensive without knowing how to defend. In other words, I found myself becoming a little embarrassed about holding these views. I began to kind of pull away from Christianity. Not so much because I didn't want to believe, but in a sense, my mind, my brain, was getting in the way. And this, I think, is the actual strategy of the new atheists, to drive a wedge between the mind on the one side and, you might say, the heart on the other. What I thought I would do this evening is I'd like to focus on a couple of the strongest arguments of the new atheism. By the way, in a debate, you don't do that. In a debate, you're focusing on the vulnerability of the other guy. You're trying to find the historical error or the logical fallacy. Someone said to me, but aren't these atheists very distinguished members of the academy? And that's true, but interestingly, in the academy, you sometimes find people who are educated a little bit beyond their intelligence. That sometimes does happen. But like I say, in a debate, you're finding the weak point of your opponent. I thought I wouldn't do that here. Rather, I want to focus on the new atheism kind of at its best. My feeling is that if we can counter the new atheism at its strongest, then we have a pretty sturdy foundation for our Christian convictions. I want to begin, if I may. I was in one of my debates with the atheist Christopher Hitchens. He began by making the point. He said, Dinesh, you Christians really sicken me because you're always going around pretending like you're better than everybody else. You have your stupid bumper stickers, what would Jesus do, your followers of Jesus, as if this is going to make you a nicer guy, a kinder, gentler, more compassionate, more honest, more truthful. He goes, that's nonsense. There's not a single virtue in the world that a Christian can practice, that an atheist or a non-Christian couldn't equally do. He says if there's a big famine tomorrow in Rwanda, yeah, the Christian can shed a tear, volunteer his or her time, or write a check. He goes, well, I can do that. So his point is, you don't need God to be good. Virtue is independent of God. You can be a good guy, and God is superfluous. Now, on the face of it, this claim that virtue is in some senses independent of theology, I think is right. We wouldn't claim that Christians have any kind of monopoly on virtue. I certainly wouldn't argue that atheists are incapable of it. But the point I want to make is that, interestingly, if we look at the virtues of Western society, in fact, focus not on Christian virtues, focus on the virtues that the atheists care about. The idea of the individual, or the right to dissent, or science as an independent and autonomous enterprise, or the equal dignity of women, or the abolition of slavery, or compassion as a social virtue. Well, if you make a list of these virtues and take a look at the list, you'll notice that most of these virtues, I think in some ways all of them, came into the West, and in some cases into the world, because of Christianity. How do we know this? Well, one way is we look to other cultures, and we find that these virtues are downplayed or not emphasized at all. Or we go to ancient Greece and Rome before Christianity, and we find these virtues largely absent. Aristotle, for example, makes a list of the virtues, and compassion, an important virtue in our society today, does not even make the list. In fact, Aristotle treats it somewhat more as a vice. Or if you consider something like the idea of human life as being important, as having value, as being precious, well, we know that the ancient Spartans would take the sick child and deposit it on the hillside in the winter, and they were happy to find it dead in the morning. In fact, the great philosophers of ancient Greece knew about this, but were unmoved by it. They viewed it with relative equanimity. It was for them no big deal. Why? Because the idea of the preciousness or sanctity of life was simply not an important value in that civilization. It became an important value in the civilization later known as Christendom. So the point I want to get at here is that, in a sense, even what we call secular virtues have a Christian foundation. The atheist is standing, you might say, on a Christian mountain that very often he or she is not willing to acknowledge.